Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Sarah. I will note my computer just told me that it ran out of battery and I briefly lost connection. So hopefully all is copacetic, everything is working now. Yes, okay, good. So this is a really, obviously momentous occasion. And it's particularly interesting for me to give this talk in part because I'm accustomed to teaching students who are generally younger than me and not themselves remember September 11th. And so, I myself was 14 years old when September 11th happened. I was in a study hall in my high school, and I remember, pretty vividly that day and the days after. And it's interesting to be speaking to an audience that have their own similarly vivid memories of those particular days. And, as I said, I lived in upstate New York, so we were about 3 hours away from New York City. And I myself am Lebanese American, so I have a good portion of family that lives in the Middle East. And something especially just crystal clear in my memory was coming home from school that day and having a message on our voice recorder, right? Back then we had answering machines, pretty wild. And it was a message from my family in Lebanon, and they were worried about our well-being. And that was not typical, right? Part of my growing up was a certain element of being worried about the well-being and safety of my family in the Middle East. And so there was something very striking about what felt to some extent like a world historical reversal of, who is in danger and who's vulnerable to violence, to threat. And, I'm sure each and every one of you have your own particular memories. And so given that, and given the kind of striking aspects of this moment to so many different people, and that I'm speaking to an audience that has those memories, I wanted to focus in today on essentially the first draft of history that's being written about this, this moment, right? You have memories of the political events, but of course now they're 20 years old, right? And this is 22 decades of unfolding history and normalization of certain changes to our society, to the US role in the world, that we're now reflecting on, and the reflection is especially acute right now because of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And my concluding slide for us today is a snapshot of some of the retrospectives and news stories and the ways that some mainstream news organizations have been attempting to account and reflect on the conclusion of the US military program in Afghanistan. And what that says about this entire project that the US undertook in the aftermath of September 11th. So just by way of sort of getting started, in the days after the atrocities of September 11th, 2001, when 2 planes struck the Empire State Building and 2 other planes were downed in either by the terrorists themselves or by passengers who intercepted the terrorists and prevented the Pentagon from being struck. This incident resulted in the death of nearly 3,000 people, right, who were killed by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda under the direction of a number of individuals, but most famously Osama bin Laden. In response to this, right, George W. Bush announced the start of a new type of war, right, a war on terror. And this war would have sort of ill-defined borders and boundaries and time and goals, but it would take shape most specifically through the wars in Afghanistan and the wars in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan most explicitly connected to the US approach to the attack on the Empire State Building, and that is where Osama bin Laden found sanctuary, formed alliances with the Taliban, and plotted the attacks. The war in Iraq, as I no doubt do not need to extensively mention, required more kind of powers of persuasion to connect the war on terror to the US desire to displace Saddam Hussein and to engage in both places in both a removal of threat to the United States through the form of terrorism, and also nation building, an effort to turn both of these nations into a form of a democracy that would be built to some extent in the US image, a democratic state with a modern capitalist kind of economic system, in the case of Iraq, explicitly trying to build a stock exchange on the model of Wall Street. And so very quickly, this attempt to redress the attacks of September 11th expanded very dramatically from a project to basically condemn enemies of the United States and condemn the actions and ideologies of those who had attacked the US into a much, much larger project that extended into 2 decades of US occupation, presence, and involvement in many countries, but most specifically Afghanistan and Iraq. This, of course, had domestic implications, right? So the first piece of sort of the historical draft is looking at the global war on terror and the nation building projects that the US undertook. And the second piece is the expansion of the national security state, the ways in which the US expanded how it thought about terrorism domestically, and the ways that the war on terror, quote unquote, came home, right? How the United States was transformed within its own borders as a result of the legislative changes and militarization that it undertook during the war on terror. So with that, I'm going to open up my slideshow. I'll sort of coalesce around these 2 big ideas, right? These 2 concepts that the first draft of the historical scholarship of this era has taken on. Again, that global war on terror and nation building. And second, the national security state and conversations about US civil liberties. So first, a bit of a, I don't know if I would call it levity, but something that provoked some bit of humor to some extent in the world of policy Twitter, which of course is its own certain strange world. But this was an image of a Taliban soldier who had taken control in Kabul in the aftermath of the US withdrawal. And of course, there's the men in the front are wearing more traditional Afghani garb, perhaps the image of more what we would expect of the Taliban. But one of the Taliban soldiers behind looked an awful lot like a US soldier. And so there is something sort of, there are a lot of layers to what's going on currently during the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. To some extent, there's a narrative, which is true, right, that the Taliban has come back to power and the Taliban was in power. And so to some extent, there's a question, what has changed? This picture, prompts some interesting questions about, what does it mean for the same organization to be in power after 20 years of US intervention? And this is a very surface level kind of, observation, but this Taliban soldier, not only is he dressed an awful lot like a US Special Forces soldier, right? But he's wearing a particular type of, hat that became, it's a company called 511. Originally, they made climbing gear. They started to make popular tactical gear that US service members began to wear. And it's literally the fashion statement of US service members has become the fashion statement of the Taliban. Now, again, this can seem very surface level, but it adds to the layers of what does it mean to, withdraw from 20 years of engagement with the country, have essentially the same group that was in power previous to that engagement retake power. There are a lot of questions, a lot of interesting conversations that can be had about that. But one is just in a picture, right, to note that the impact of the US presence will be felt in an enormity of ways, and that it has raised enormous questions about not only the impact of the type of military occupation and military practices that the US used in order to fight the war on terror and to occupy Afghanistan, but also what are some of the impacts of those methods, that presence, upon the way that peoples, that were occupied the US are now going to use US strategies, US style, right? US gear, US military equipment for their own purposes, right? And so anytime there is a military confrontation, you're learning from the successes and failures, not only of your own troops, but of course of your opponent. And so there's no question, right, that there will be a lot of outcomes for the Taliban, for Afghanistan, broadly speaking, that are influenced by their 2 decades of experience being occupied by the United States. So one of the major questions, right, that has been sort of raised and is coming to the fore once again is this question of, if we're talking about ending the US occupation in Afghanistan, does that mean that the United States is also ending the war on terror? What exactly is ending here, right? And of course, what historians like to do is go back to the beginning. What did we say we were doing, right? What was the framing that the US undertook when the war on terror began, right? And of course, there are many, many statements. There's a proliferation of statements that you can look at. But arguably one of the earliest and one of the most influential was the address that George W. Bush gave to the nation on September 20th, 2001, when he spelled out his first kind of draft of what the war on terror was going to be. And he said, quote, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists," right? And especially that last passage, I think, was quoted quite a bit in terms of framing US foreign policy after September 11th, right? And drawing a stark line in terms of how the war on terror was going to reshape the US relationship with nations across the globe. But notable here, right, is that the amorphousness, right, of who and what and where the United States is declaring war upon, right? That it is certainly specifically declaring war on Al-Qaeda, the organization led by Osama bin Laden that initiated and executed the attacks on the United States. But it's also very clear, right, that this is a much bigger confrontation in this speech anyway, that it will have global reach, and that it claims to undertake to find, stop, and defeat terrorism, right? Of course, one of the enormous challenges of the next 2 decades will be deciding which terrorism affects the United States, and which terrorism, which sort of acts of the political tool of terrorism must be stopped, right? And it becomes clear relatively quickly into the United States' presence in Afghanistan, but even more so in Iraq, that the original organization, right, Al-Qaeda, has spawned other organizations, right? And what does it mean that for there to be many more organizations that sometimes have the US as their #1 target, sometimes have allies of the US as their #1 target, sometimes are seeking to just spark disarray and attack civilians, right? Where does the United States draw the line, given this framing of a war on terror, in terms of who explicitly is the US enemy and how is the United States going to approach those enemies? And we see the fact that this has not been sorted out in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? So on August 26th, right, just a couple of weeks ago, the US was drawing down its final troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. And on that day at the Kabul airport, amidst both US citizens and Afghanis that had worked closely with the United States and hoped to leave Afghanistan, there was an attack by a group called ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan. This is an offshoot of the ISIS that was present and powerful in northern Syria and Iraq. And they killed 13 US servicemen, and notably, right, and I think this is a fact that has been repeated quite a bit, but all but 2 of those US servicemen were toddlers when September 11th, when the September 11th attacks took place, right? And so this terrorist attack on US forces attempting to leave Afghanistan took the lives of many US forces who were not even alive, or were not, certainly not adults, when the act that initiated this whole war took place. And in response to this attack, right, Biden gave a speech in which he reiterated that, he used the statistic, 90% of Americans want a withdrawal from Afghanistan, and other, Pew statistical reports find similar numbers, right? That it's probably a little bit high, but not outrageously high. That, he wants to continue the withdrawal, and he did. But while also making, once again, this statement that terrorism is unacceptable, right? And he uses phrasing that's very reminiscent of the phrasing right after September 11th, right? He says, quote, "We will hunt you down and make you pay," right? So that there is no kind of space for violent attacks on US service members that will not be unpunished, right? While at the same time withdrawing from Afghanistan, withdrawing from the first place that the United States invaded, and turning over the country, right, to essentially the Taliban. And so what's different here in Biden's speech is, one, he emphasizes a popular support or broad popular support for the US withdrawal, really relies on that. And he also seeks to divorce the fight against terrorism from the attempts to build Afghanistan into a, quote, unified centralized democracy, right? So seeking to pull apart the US fight against terrorism and, a vow to avenge violent attacks on US troops and any Americans from the broader project that was undertaken in Afghanistan and in Iraq to create nations on the model of the United States, right? That the war on terror should no longer include these nation building projects. And this is a pretty big distinction, right, from the ways in which the war on terror was not only executed and developed in the decades after September 11th, but also a pretty big departure from some of the justifications for what the United States was doing, right? Why was the US in Afghanistan for 2 decades? Especially after Osama bin Laden was found and killed, there needed to be further explanation of what precisely the United States was doing. And of course, many of the kind of ways it was justified continue to be that there were, groups that engaged in violence against US troops there, and that there was a persistent need to fight against them. But a larger narrative that really helped this US occupation endure was that the US was working towards building a democracy. And that second piece seems to have been fully kind of repudiated by the Biden administration. And so this raises many questions, right? But one that historians and other scholars are really kind of honing in on is how do you calculate the costs of this global war on terror, right? What has it cost the United States and really the globe, right, to have this kind of global war making on such an enormous scale? And so one measure, of course, is focusing on US service member deaths, right? And so if we were to look at those, we have a firm number right? 7,057 US service members have been killed in post-September 11th war operations. The next question, right, often expands into what happens when we think about the mental health costs. And there has been a huge amount of awareness raising in terms of just the sheer burden on soldiers, right, when they return home. And of course, this number is much larger, right, that 30,177 US service members and veterans of these wars have taken their own lives. So, you know, that's certainly one measure, right? There's an enormous American loss of life. And some people would throw in, well, okay, 3,000 US, nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in the September 11th attacks. You know, what does it mean that many more were lost in the effort to avenge these attacks? And the number can get larger, right? If you include contractors, right? Which one feature of the US war on terror was that there were significant, you know, troop deployments, but there were also very significant contracts being granted to contractors, many of whom were former US service members, but expanding far beyond that, right, to privatize and outsource a lot of the functions of the US occupations in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And so this is a huge number of people, many of whom, vast majority of whom were Americans living and working, performing support services for the US military occupations in these countries. And then you start seeing, you know, 8,000 of these contractors, right, died during these occupations, right? So the numbers can start getting bigger pretty quickly. What about when you include US allies, right? So the enormous number of people in the countries that the United States was conducting operations who worked with them, right? Who worked with the US forces. So these are Afghani, Iraqi police, Syrian police to some extent, Syrian particular militias that allied with the United States in the fight against ISIS. This is where the numbers start getting way fuzzier, right? This is very much in the realm of estimates, but the numbers are large, right? There's an estimated 177,000 people that who were direct allies working closely with US war efforts who were killed in this aftermath, right? What happens when we start talking about civilian deaths, right? And look broadly at the kind of disarray and political instability that takes shape. And this is especially sort of turbulent, and these numbers become extraordinarily large when we start looking at especially the US occupation in Iraq. And with the creation of ISIS, right, you have an organization that is targeting and fighting certainly against US forces, but very much so against other Iraqis, right, and Syrians. And so there's just a huge growth in terms of when we think about sort of the butterfly effect, right? When we look at the impact of US occupation and engagement and look at the wars that have taken place, really drawing out from those conflicts. And this is where, right, the more direct impact is looking at US drone strikes and US military strikes. And, you know, some of those deaths are certainly intended targets. Many, of course, are not. Those numbers are in the realm of 22,000 to 48,000. But when we start looking at that really big picture of just the turbulence that has arrived in the Middle East in the decades after September 11th, nearly 1 million people, right, have been directly killed in the post-September 11th wars. Many of those were combatants of some kind, but there's an estimate that around 365,000 civilians were amongst those killed. And those estimates come from an organization called Air Wars. It's a British and Welsh nonprofit that has worked, and it was founded in 2014 to calculate deaths and civilian casualties caused by ISIS, but they retrospectively worked with other nonprofit organizations that have been working in the region since September 11th to try to calculate these numbers. And of course, right, these are estimates, so they certainly could be wrong, but it's also, there are good reasons to be aware of the sheer amount of disruption, right? And even if these numbers are not perfect, there's something very striking in the sheer amount of disruption and upending of life that has happened as a result of these occupations, right? And then, of course, there's the financial estimate. And this is something that Brown University has conducted a cost of war project. And there are many estimates floating around, but there's, is one that recently came out for this 20-year anniversary. And they have estimated that the US global war on terror has cost something in the vicinity of $8 trillion. It is worth noting sometimes the narrative is that this is money that just sort of went out the door. As I mentioned before, a lot of the work that was being done, right? Certainly much of this is US service members, but a ton of it is private contracts that are going to US defense contractors, and sometimes new businesses being set up to serve the needs of the US occupations. And so a lot of this money is being recycled within the US economy, but it's government funds that are being spent for these occupations, but it's not necessarily money that's going outside of the United States. In fact, the vast majority of it is being paid to US contractors who are engaging in some respect or some faction of the US war-making effort in this global war. So there's a lot of ways of trying to gain a hold of the sheer enormity of the US approach to the global war on terror. I think this effort right now to try to get a hold of the costs and think through different ways that we might calculate them, that we might grasp them, is one interesting way and a particularly kind of powerful way recently that both economists, historians, and lots of different scholars have tried to just create an aggregate of what does it mean for there to have been 2 decades of conflict, right? How do you turn this into something that people can latch hold of to some extent? And of course, this particular graph is also worth looking at a little bit more closely in that these are not the impacts of conflict in the Middle East as a result of this global war on terror has not been steady throughout, right? There were certainly peaks and valleys. And I don't know how large your screens are, but it's very clear the impact of ISIS, right? So some of the most significant civilian casualties took place 2014 to 2019, right? That is when ISIS is at its strongest and really wreaking havoc in the lives of people in Iraq and Syria, and to some extent other places, but especially there. But the other peak is certainly in 2003, 2004 in Iraq, and that there was a lot of chaos and violence in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq. And in fact, that is the single most deadly year, right, to be an Iraqi in the past 20 years was the year 2003, right? And so that is more firmly aligned with the US occupation of and takeover of Iraq. So that's, sort of one big way that we might take on assessing the costs of the global war on terror. Another is that there were many ways in which the war came home, so to speak, right? And one that was, has been experienced by nearly anyone that has flown in the past 2 decades, right, is that there's been an enormous rise in the scrutiny of people who are engaging in air travel. And it can be a little bit strange to try to remember a time before this level of scrutiny. It's been enormously normalized. But this serves somewhat as a metaphor for the ways in which a certain amount of surveillance and exposure to, a new societal norm, right? That it just must be accepted that in order to avert another terrorist attack, there must be changes to certain forms of American life. And one legislative piece that really caused a lot of anxiety at the time, but has essentially been entrenched into the US national security state was the Usa Patriot Act. And this created frameworks for government agents to search private property without first notifying the owners, for officials being able to review information held by third parties, right? Today we hear of this often, is Google required to turn over information about, X people that the US government is interested in learning about their online activity? That's an outgrowth of the USA Patriot Act, right? That there might be basically that you are not in control of your information in all circumstances, right? That there can be security justifications or requests where a third party or a company might be required to turn over your personal information because of the idea that it could pose a threat to the nation. And this act and these transformations weakened what is, part of the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment, that protect against search and seizure, right? And so they expanded the ways and the methods that were considered legal and constitutional for US officials to gather information about US citizens. And this was called at the time expanding tap and trace searches, honing in especially on phone tapping. But it gave much greater power to, if there was a perceived national security threat, emails and phone calls could be reviewed, tapped without a warrant. And these powers were further entrenched, right, in 2008 and expanded. And so this has become a persistent and probably irrevocable feature of the ways that US society and US law has transformed as a result of September 11th. More recent investigations into how these expansions of power were used have honed in on the ways that they were used to surveil and target Muslim American communities. And there was dramatic increase in surveillance of mosques. There were certain instances of entrapment of people who, were offered full-fledged kind of plans by FBI agents, et cetera, to engage in terrorist actions and arrested, right, when they showed any measure of interest in this plan that was offered them. So lots of sort of ethical concerns about methods and measures of law enforcement. And then there were immigration changes, right, that specified that all Muslim immigrants to the United States who were under the age of 26 had to submit to certain types of check-ins and restriction on their visas, basically because of concerns about if these were people that the US trusted as immigrants. So a lot of changes that are relevant to every American citizen in terms of really important legislative changes to the powers of the judiciary, and then also really specific changes that targeted Muslim and often Arab communities in the United States. and put extra obstacles in their ability to gain citizenship to the US for especially Muslim male immigrants under the age of 26, right, which was considered to be a particularly concerning group under these new restrictions. Another way, right, that this has enormously changed the United States is the militarization of law enforcement, right? So there's a lot of interesting scholarship has come out about, you know, a lot of the military equipment that the US innovated and used in Iraq and Afghanistan. Certainly some of it has been left in Afghanistan or in Iraq, but a lot of it came home in various forms. And this is a news story from 2014 about a new piece of equipment that the Wichita Police Department acquired. There's nothing unusual about this, right? It's just we're in Wichita, so we're talking about Wichita. But the federal government created a program called the 1033 program to distribute unneeded military equipment to police departments across the country for free. And this ranged from, you know, fairly non-militarized things like computer chairs to highly militarized things like helicopters, right? That the tools and machinery that the United States was using abroad was going to become new tools and machinery that will be used in the United States, right? And this has certainly raised questions among people who are concerned about the militarization of the police, right? In terms of what does it mean for a police force to be using weaponry that was used against, you know, terrorist groups, against enemies of the United States? Is that a visual that is conducive to community policing, right? What kinds of capabilities should US police forces have in their confrontations with by and large US citizens, or at least US residents, right, for the vast majority. And so this image again is from a 2014 story that KMUW reported that the Wichita Police Department had received an international Max Pro, a type of mine resistant ambush protected vehicle, right? And they have used it a number of times since then. And so finally, this is a time in which a lot of news programs, news media are having conversations like this one, right? And people are thinking through, right? How do you make sense of 2 decades of conflict against a type of war, right? But also in which there have been so many enormous costs and so many transformations of US life that it's hard to account for it all, right? It's hard to even remember how much things have changed to some extent. And one, you know, thread of thinking, I think, especially with the Taliban coming back to power in Afghanistan, is a certain sense of agony over what feels like a return to a condition that the US had sought to eliminate, right? I don't think that there is anybody who would be pleased, you know, if we were to time travel back to 2001 to learn that upon the withdrawal of US troops, the power in place is again the Taliban. And so what does it mean that the US, it's popular in the United States for the US to withdraw? That it doesn't seem even to the most, you know, even to analysts that are very unhappy with the way that the US withdrawal took place, it's extremely rare to find somebody who thinks that more time in Afghanistan would yield a dramatically different result, right? There are very few people that think that there are more potential military strategies that would result in a democratic Afghanistan, right? That's not a common view. And so how do Americans, how do policymakers reflect on this era? Is it to be thought of as a failure, as this one New York Times headline says, right? 9/11 was a test. The books of the last 2 decades show how America failed. What does it mean that the Washington Post is running a headline that says the US could work with the Taliban against terrorists, the Pentagon says, right? So the US Pentagon is saying that the Taliban is not the threat any longer. There are other terrorists that are the threat, and that the US should work with the Taliban against them. Or then this article from Foreign Policy magazine that seems to fly pretty firmly in the face of the statement that George W. Bush meant, right? That there is, terrorism must be eliminated, right, wherever it is. Here you have a foreign policy scholar writing in Foreign Affairs magazine, the good enough doctrine, learning to live with terrorism. And so it seems that there are a lot of questions, right, about how the United States should gather lessons from 2 decades of conflict that resulted in what it has resulted in. But there's also reflections that highlight some other conflicting, but perhaps good, I guess, outcomes, right? Which is, although it is certainly true, right, that there are far more people who are members of organizations that the US government calls terrorist organizations. So far more terrorists, according to the US government, exist in the world today than they did on September 11th, 2001. However, almost none of those have been able to initiate any attacks on US soil, right? And so there have been attacks by people in the US who say that they're acting in the name of ISIS, right? But no terrorist attacks coordinated in the Middle East, initiated in the United States, have been basically enacted, right? So again, you have individuals who say they're inspired by ISIS, but they're not organizing and training in the Middle East, right? So far larger numbers of terrorists exist, but it seems as though it has gotten harder, or at least has been successful to some extent. The US war on terror has been successful to some extent in preventing any similar kind of attack on the United States. So with that, basically raising a lot of questions, trying to sum up 2 of the big threads that historians are using to try to sort out the meaning of the changes to the globe to some extent, and to life in the United States. I look forward to hearing all of your questions.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Some that, like, and because you've witnessed it for the last 20 years, but seeing it all together in one infographic is kind of mind-blowing. So everyone, if you could please type your questions into the chat box, we'll get this Q&A started. We have about 14 minutes for that. So any questions that you have for Dr. Ballout? I remember when the Patriot Act came through, it was huge implications for the library world, actually, because privacy of our patrons and what they're checking out, what they're researching, what they're studying, has always been a pretty high goal for librarians. And so when the Patriot Act came out, I remember that having huge implications for our field, when you wouldn't really think about it. You would think about it from the criminal side of things or the immigration side of things, but not usually libraries. And we were right there in the thick of it.
Right. Any holders of information, right?
Exactly.
If any private information can be considered part of national security, then anyone that holds private information can be called upon to basically decide if they are, is this a legitimate request? Is it an illegitimate request? And it sent those questions into all corners of American life in ways that I think, as you're noting, right, were pretty unexpected to some extent.
I remember, and I don't know if this is how library software was developed, like in specific response to the Patriot Act, but at least with ours, some people come in and they want to know how, what they've checked out in the past, and you have to actually opt into that. We don't collect that data on your behalf unless you specifically ask for it, because it leaves us open to those kinds of questions. Again, I don't know that like it was in a direct response to the Patriot Act, but it kind of lines up.
I mean, one way in which I know that did happen, right, is that there are all kinds of books in libraries, right? There are books that give information about things that can lead to bomb making, right? Or things that lead to certain kinds of political ideas. And there certainly were questions sometimes about, how do we establish if this person was researching something, right, that would lead us to think that they were plotting something? Well, part of it is what were they taking out of the library, right? So it wasn't, yeah, I think there certainly were cases where information from public libraries were essential to either making or breaking a particular case.
Yeah. Kind of wild when you think about it. Anybody have any questions? We did cover a lot of material today.
Hopefully I didn't talk too fast.
I was wondering through when you were going through everything, just, what are the takeaways from this? Did anything positive come out of our presence over there? And I'm sure that there were some, but it does seem that a lot of it has been, negative, waste of money, waste of life. And so I'm wondering if in your, from your point of view, do you see any positives from our 20-year presence over there?
Yeah, it's, I think it's very hard to see big positives. I think, the one that I cited is really the big one that I come back to, which is that there have been no significant, terrorist attacks on US soil, and that's no doubt really important. But, I think it has come at an enormous cost to Americans and to people of the region. And given that other fact, right, that there's an enormous proliferation of people that are now part of militarized organizations that are avowed enemies of the United States, there's a lot of questions as to if that will persist, right, and what forms those kinds of political animosities will take in the future, right? And so it's unfolding history. I think it's really hard to assess anything after only 20 years, even if we should start doing it, right, as we are. But it's, yeah, I think, especially in this particular moment, it's very hard to look back and feel like very many of the hopes that were undertaken were realized. It seems, and the headlines that I showed kind of convey that dim view, right?
We did have a couple questions come in. Do you feel that the current exit has hurt our relationship with our current allies in the Middle East?
Right, and I think it depends which allies you're talking about. There certainly is an enormous responsibility that the US has, I think, to the Afghanis that worked closely with the United States. I think there is time for the US to better fulfill its promises to the security and safety of people that put their lives and their families' lives on the line for US troops and the US mission in Afghanistan. So that's unfolding, right? In terms of the bigger picture, right, 20 years of occupation and conflicts, if ending that is going to make other nations think that the US is not a reliable ally, I don't really see that happening, right? I think that the US committed itself enormously, right? It just didn't want to commit itself forever. And I'm not sure what other endpoint was on the horizon. And the US allies in the Middle East, right, there are many, but, and potentially, according to the Washington Post, potentially even the Taliban to some extent going forward. But Saudi Arabia and Israel, right, stand out as the two nations that the US has the closest kind of military and diplomatic relationships with. And those relationships are based on such different intertwining of interests and economic policies that I don't think they look at Afghanistan and see much of an echo to their relationship to the United States. There's a lot of really important differences that are going to continue to bind the United States to sharing interests with both of those nations that were not really the definition of the US relationship with Afghanistan.
One of our audience members asks, will you please share your displays and events on your campus or at your library? Are you doing something that she's calling out?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'd be happy to. I have no plans to do such a thing. But,
I mean, if you want to maybe clarify your question, I'll ask that. In the meantime, we can move on to this next one. Are other countries in danger of being run over by the Taliban?
So the Taliban are an interesting organization for a lot of reasons, but one is that they have a pretty shaky hold actually on Afghanistan right now. They have worked closely with Pakistani intelligence over the past 2 decades, which is its own can of worms because Pakistani intelligence is in theory allied with the United States, but also has been working with the Taliban. So that there's the word alliance takes on some unique meanings when we're talking about the sheer amount of money, military equipment, and lived realities that have been on the ground, right, in this region. But all this goes to say that the attack on the airport by ISIS-K a couple of weeks ago, it certainly was targeting US service members, and but it was also targeting the Taliban. And this is why there is some thought that among Pentagon officials that the United States might have a relationship with the Taliban going forward. The enemy of anybody that's trying to take power is instability. And so if the Taliban wants to enshrine its power in Afghanistan, it now has to fight against groups that are going to compete with it. And, you know, a group like ISIS-K sees itself now as a competitor for power with the Taliban, even if they are an offshoot of the Taliban. And so does the Taliban, you know, as a political entity, pose an enormous threat to Pakistan, you know, or other nations in the region? There's a small border with China, right? I don't think so. However, right, what really remains to be seen is, will the Taliban be able to secure control, right, over the entirety of the nation of Afghanistan? And if they cannot, do organizations like ISIS-K become thorns in the side of not only the Taliban, but also Pakistan, but of other neighboring countries, right? And China is also worried about this, where they would like to form a reasonably strong relationship with the Taliban because they are worried about a group that they do not have a particularly good relationship, the Uyghurs, Chinese Muslims that are in the western provinces of China and that they've been engaging in a form of genocide against. But that population, you know, it may form some ties with groups in Afghanistan and may cause security problems for China, right? So there's instability is the enemy of everyone. And there are a lot of threats, I think, to lots of people that can come out of Afghanistan. But I don't think that the primary threat is the Taliban themselves. I think it's other organizations taking advantage of chaos and disarray.
Sorry, I had to like take a second to just like let that soak in a little bit. There was Carmen did say that the poster exhibit for 9/11, 2001, the day that changed the world, and a recording of the training session for this exhibition, and shared a link in the chat. So I'm not sure what that is, so I can't encourage or deny, but it comes from a reliable source. So anyway, you might check that out. Are there any things going on at WSU in recognition of the 20th year of 9/11?
Not that I'm aware of. You know, but it does sound as though there is a poster exhibition that I should know about. So in part, I think because of our strange Zoom world hybrid life, there has been a slow dissemination of valuable information. And so there may be more going on than I know about. And I started at WSU 6 months before COVID descended upon us. And so even though this is the start of my 3rd year, I've mostly lived in Zoom world, which I think means that sometimes I'm out of the loop. So maybe there's stuff happening that I don't know about.
I think that's fair. That's okay. I will give everyone one final chance to submit a question in the chat, because we do have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and post the survey one more time. That's a survey for our program today. We appreciate your responses when you fill that out. Let us know what you thought about today's program. We do look at those, and so your responses are valuable to us. Okay, one more question rolled in. To what extent does the U.S. dependence on oil affect which other countries we are concerned about?
Yeah, this is an enormous question that has dogged the U.S. war on terror since its origins, right? Even if we want to go back to the Persian Gulf War in 1991, where the U.S. undertook its first post-Cold War military action to essentially defend Saudi oil fields from Saddam Hussein's incursion into Kuwait. So it makes an impact. There's no question about that. However, right, that's not the only force that's driving things here, right? If you look at the map of where the US has sent troops and engaged in its biggest military actions, it's not only places that have oil. And so it's a really important factor, and it seems to have been an extremely important factor in the invasion of Iraq. It's a less important factor and has played a smaller role in the US invasion of Afghanistan. There are some really important questions as to how much it was driving the US invasion of Libya in 2011, which was a much shorter piece of the war on terror, but it was tied in. And, there are certainly lots of people that their source of frustration with these wars is that the US doesn't seem to get much resource-wise on the other end of them, right? And so out of the war in Iraq, US did not get very many kind of significant oil contracts. Similarly with Libya, many European states benefited the most in some ways out of Libya, although now all of that is sort of in disarray. But, what's the role of resources? It is there, it's really significant, but it's layered on to other questions about perceived threat, confrontation to some extent with Russia and China, right? Other regional power plays, and basically questions about supporting other allies, right? So there's a persistent confrontation between the United States and Iran, in part because the US is trying to back up Saudi Arabia in their own regional conflict. And that's sort of about oil. Both of them are oil-rich states, but it's also about ensuring that you keep one ally happy in order to protect that relationship. So oil is there, but also regional politics are there. So yeah, I'll pause there to basically say it matters, but it's in a soup of other things that matter too.
Yeah, it seems like everything when it comes to our relations over there is very nuanced and multi-layered. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of today's program. I really want to thank Dr. Ballout for speaking with us today. We appreciate your insights into this very important topic and sharing with us all that you did. Especially given the recent events, the fact that you were able to dive into some of that really helped us understand that. So thank you.